Good evening, and welcome to another Slowburn story. Before we begin on our literary lullaby, we encourage you to like and subscribe. This lets us know you appreciate the work we've done, helping you to drift to sleep. And lastly, we kindly ask you drop a comment letting us know where and when in the world you are tuning in from. It always warms my heart to see listeners from around the globe engaging in beautiful stories. Now that is out of the way, let's begin. The ferry pulled away without a sound, just the hush of the sea folding over itself. The travelers stood still on the weather-worn dock, one hand wrapped around the strap of a canvas bag, the other resting lightly on the pocket of her coat, not to reach for anything, but just to feel the shape of stillness. She had left behind a life of hard edges and clattering noise, cities that never stopped, people who never paused. Here, in the fog-thick harbor of Bellwether-on-Sea, the world had slowed, or perhaps she had finally caught up to the quiet. Salt hung in the air, mingling with the damp scent of seaweed and wood smoke. Waves tapped against the old dock pilings like a memory gently asking to be noticed. The sky above was the color of unpolished silver. Clouds drifted like lazy ships, and the wind wasn't sharp. It was sleepy, almost forgetful, the kind of wind that wandered off mid-sentence. She breathed it in. Her shoulders dropped a little. For the first time in many months, maybe years, she didn't feel watched, or rushed, or behind. The village itself rose behind you like something out of a soft-spined storybook. Stone cottages with sloped roofs leaned slightly toward each other, as though they were whispering secrets too old to be retold. Wooden shutters, some closed against the mist, others cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of candlelight, lined the narrow lanes. Moss crept up door frames and curled along cobblestones, undeterred by time. No honking horns, no neon signs, just the occasional clatter of a teacup, the distant ring of a shop bell, and birdsong so gentle it almost sounded invented. It was beautiful, not the glossy kind, not the sharp magazine cover kind, but the deep beauty that settles beneath your ribs, the kind that feels earned, secret, personal. You had come here without much of a plan, only a letter. Folded so many times the edges had gone soft. The handwriting, delicate and curved, spelled out a name they hadn't heard in years, and below it the words, "If you're ever tired of the noise, find Bellwether. It remembers people like you." That was all. No return address. Just the whisper of a place. And so she had come. The inn was easy to find. There weren't many buildings tall enough to be more than 2 stories. It stood on the edge of the village like an old woman keeping one eye on the sea and one on the kettle. The Salt Lantern it was called, and true to its name, a gently swinging lantern hung outside its crooked door, the glass panes clouded with salt and age. Yellow light glowed within like a pulse. She paused before going in. Let the sound of the wind against the inn's eaves settle into their breath. Let the silence of the place wrap around her bones. Then, with the softest creak of the floorboards, they stepped inside. Warmth. Not just in temperature, though. Yes, there was a fire dancing in the hearth, and the air smelled faintly of nutmeg and peat, but in the way the room looked at you, as if it was glad you'd arrived. There was a small lobby with 2 well-worn armchairs, a row of coat hooks, each different from the next, and behind the counter stood an innkeeper who might have been carved from driftwood and kindness. She didn't speak at first, just handed them a key from a hook marked Quint's room, and tilted her head in the direction of a staircase. Her smile, though slight, was enough to assure the traveler they'd made the right choice. The kind of smile that doesn't need to prove anything. The room was small and perfect. A window framed the sea, or rather, the fog that hid it. Pale curtains danced in a breeze that had snuck in from somewhere. The bed was covered in a quilt patched together with soft blues and faded florals. There was a stack of books on the nightstand, a chipped mug waiting for tea. The traveler dropped their bag, sat down, and took their boots off slowly, like the day itself needed to be undressed. They sat in the silence for a long time, not doing anything, just listening to the hush of a world that had nothing urgent to say. Days passed like the pages of a slow novel. The traveler explored. The town unfolded gently, like a letter written long ago but never sent. There was a tea shop run by an older man with a voice like velvet and a laugh that seemed too large for such a quiet village. A woman in a yellow shawl sold bread from a cart that smelled like rosemary and sea salt. Children in thick socks played marbles near the fountain and didn't stop to ask who the traveler was. They just smiled and waved. The pace of things was different here. Even the weather didn't seem to hurry. Rain came like a sigh and left with an apology. And always there was the fog. Not threatening, not eerie, just present. It filled alleyways and coiled beneath fences. Some mornings it was thin and lace-like, barely there. Other days it settled heavy on the ground like a blanket pulled up too high. One evening, it rolled down the hills like someone had shaken a great silver cloth across the sky. And it always carried with it a feeling, a brushing at the edge of thought, like something just out of sight was watching gently, not with judgment, but with longing, as though the fog itself was remembering something you had forgotten. It was during one of those fog-thick afternoons that the traveler first heard about the bookshop. They were in the tea shop, stirring honey into something fragrant and steaming, when an elderly couple at the next table mentioned it in passing. "You know," the woman said, brushing crumbs from her lap, "I think it might have opened again." Her partner raised an eyebrow. "In this weather?" She nodded. "That's when it does open, when the fog's thick enough to hide it." The man chuckled. If it ever existed at all, probably just old stories. But the traveler's ears had already tuned to the words like a struck bell. Later, walking past a row of shops with painted signs and crooked windows, they asked a shopkeeper about it, the bookshop. "Oh, love, it's just a tale," the woman said with a wink. "Though my aunt swears she went once, said the books in there whispered to her, gave her dreams for a week." At the post office, the clerk, a man with round glasses and too many cardigans, leaned in as if confiding a secret. "They say it moves," he murmured, "shifts itself into the fog. You can't find it by looking. It finds you when it's ready." The traveler tried not to smile too obviously. "And when is that?" He just shook his head. "No one knows, but it's always when you need it most." That night, back in the quince room, the traveler sat by the window. The fog was so thick it seemed to press its forehead to the glass. The sea was gone, the village too. All that remained was the soft glow of distant lanterns, bobbing like ghosts across the hillside. They opened the window just a crack, let the cool air settle on their skin, and for just a moment it felt like the fog was speaking. A whisper, not words, just an impression. "Come closer." They closed the window, pulled the quilt up, and dreamed of paper lanterns floating over water, of turning pages, and of someone waiting on the edge of the world. Morning came, but the light barely shifted. A soft silver haze filtered through the lace curtains, making the room glow faintly like the inside of a seashell. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, but the bed remained warm. The air still scented faintly with lavender and something deeper wood smoke and weathered books, maybe. The traveler lay still beneath the patchwork quilt, eyes half open, and let the quiet of the town press softly against their thoughts. No footsteps outside the window, no gulls. Just the rhythmic hush of fog brushing against stone and window pane, like a cat rubbing affectionately along familiar walls. They didn't feel like a stranger anymore, just someone waiting for something they couldn't name. By the time they stepped outside, the village had disappeared. Bellwether-on-Sea was still there, of course, its crooked chimneys and hand-painted signs, its stone garden walls and weathered gates, but it had all gone muffled beneath the fog. Nothing more than shapes in the whiteness. The traveler could see their boots, the edges of buildings, and not much else. The kind of fog you could lose your name in, the kind that asked you to be someone else for a while. They walked without plan, past the tea shop and the shuttered bakery, past the statue in the square and the bent postbox with its permanent lean, past all the places they had come to know, and then into a path they had never noticed before. It was narrow and curved sharply between two houses, leading away from the main street and down into a tangle of ivy-choked trees and moss-covered steps. The air grew cooler, quieter. The traveler felt the silence change, not empty but full, the way a theater feels right before the curtain lifts. And then, quite suddenly, there it was. The shop, tucked into the base of a cliff, half embedded in rock and half draped in ivy and fog. It looked like it had grown there rather than been built. A stone structure, small but sturdy, with soft amber light glowing from round-paned windows and a carved wooden sign swinging slightly in the misty breeze. Whispering pages, it read, the letters curled like vines. The door was painted a deep, soft green, weathered at the edges from salt and age. A single bell hung above it, shaped like a tiny copper seashell. The traveler paused, hand outstretched, and truly felt that they were being watched, not in a fearful way, but with expectancy, as though the shop had been waiting for them, as though it had always known they would come. They pushed the door open. Warmth, again. But this was a different kind of warmth, not the flicker of a tavern fire or the dry heat of the sun, but a softer, older warmth, the kind you get from long shelves of aged paper, from lanterns and wool blankets and tea left just long enough to cool beside a book you forgot you were reading. The smell was intoxicating. Old pages, cinnamon, the faintest trace of clove, dust in the best way lived in, comforting, like the room itself had inhaled deeply and hadn't yet exhaled. There were books everywhere, not just on shelves though, those stretched from floor to ceiling, some with ladders leaning against them, but on tables, in stacks on the floor, nestled on windowsills, tucked into baskets and drawers and old traveling trunks. One shelf leaned slightly as though it had always had a secret. Another seemed impossibly tall, its uppermost books disappearing into shadow. Every book looked like it had a story beyond the one written inside. Some were tied in ribbon. Others bore strange little bookmarks shaped like pressed flowers or dried leaves. It was, quite simply, magic. And then he appeared. The bookseller. He emerged from behind a tall stack of red-spine novels, brushing a bit of dust from his sweater sleeve, his expression calm but unmistakably curious. He was taller than the traveler expected, though not by much, with dark, loosely curled hair that was slightly mussed, as though he'd just run a hand through it in thought. His jaw was strong but softened by days without shaving. His eyes, when they met the traveler's, were dark and arresting, not intense in a sharp way, but in the way deep lakes are, still, watchful, possibly bottomless. He wore a cardigan that had clearly seen better days but clung to his frame in just the right places. The sleeves pushed up to the forearms revealed hands ink-stained and slightly calloused. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower than expected, and slow, a little sleep-warmed, a little amused. I have always imagined that paradise will be a kind of library. Jorge Luis Borges. The traveler blinked. Excuse me? His mouth twitched at the corner. Not quite a smile. It's how I greet first-timers. A quote. You'd be surprised how many people don't recognize it. He paused. You didn't? No, the traveler said slowly, but it's a good one. Now he smiled full this time, quiet but utterly disarming. It suits the place. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask what they wanted. He simply stepped out from behind the stack and gestured casually toward the room. I think there's something here for you, he said. There usually is. He walked slowly, letting his fingers trail along the edge of a shelf. The books find their own readers. All I do is keep the shelves from falling over. He paused beside a narrow alcove and drank a fair amount of tea. The traveler followed, hypnotized by the rhythm of his voice. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried, assured, like someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. The cardigan hung open, revealing the collar of a shirt that looked hand-washed and imperfectly ironed. He wore a leather cord around his wrist. and faint stubble shadowed the lines of his throat. Everything about him felt lived in, and lovely in the kind of way that sneaks up on you, the kind of lovely that makes you look twice, even if you don't know why. They passed a table covered in poetry collections, a chair with a half-read volume, and a cup of cold tea beside it, and a tall spiral staircase that disappeared into a ceiling crowded with paper stars. Finally, he stopped. Reaching between two shelves, he pulled out a thin book with a cover the color of dusk. It was unlabeled, save for a small pressed flower tucked beneath the ribbon. He handed it to the traveler carefully, as though offering something private. "It's always this one," he said, "when people come through the fog." The traveler took it. It was heavier than it looked, familiar somehow, as if they'd read it before in another life. They glanced up to thank him, but he was already walking away, humming softly under his breath, back toward the dimmer half of the shop. The cardigan moved with him, sleeves pushed just enough to expose the lines of his forearms, the slope of his back outlined against the lantern glow. And for just a moment, only a moment, the traveler wondered what it might feel like to read a book aloud beside him, with the windows fogged and the hours unfolding like pages. Between silences meant for two, the bookshop became a ritual, not in the loud, conscious way that routines form, but in the quiet, inevitable sense that some places remember you and wait. The traveler returned the next morning, and again the day after that. Each visit was like stepping out of the present and into a version of reality that moved slower, softer. Outside, the sea heaved and whispered. Inside, time grew drowsy. The bookseller never asked why they came. He simply welcomed them with a glance slow, deliberate, and edged with something more than politeness. Something the traveler was not quite ready to name. He always seemed to be waiting, not obviously, but in the way a page waits to be turned. He would be dusting a top shelf, leaning up in a way that made the hem of his cardigan rise just slightly at the waist, or crouched by a half-sorted stack, sleeves pushed to his elbows, hair rumpled like it had been rearranged by thought rather than wind, always absorbed in something when they arrived, but never surprised to see them. "Good fog this morning," he said on their third visit without looking up from the spine of a French novella. "That's the best kind, the kind that makes things feel more possible." The traveler lingered near the poetry shelf. Possible how? Now he looked up, eyes dark, unreadable. Things that are always there, but easier to believe in when the rest of the world fades away. It wasn't a flirtation, not quite, but it made the traveler feel as though she'd been written into something secret. That afternoon he made tea, not offered made, a quiet assertion of comfort. The kettle sat on a small iron stove tucked behind a curtain of books and lace. The mug he handed her was chipped at the rim, but warm, and full of something steeped with cloves and orange peel. She sipped. It tasted like winter stories and half-finished poems. They sat near the front window, the fog pressing thickly against the glass, as though trying to listen in. A small round table separated their chairs. He sat opposite her, one leg folded beneath the other, reading a book with one hand and resting the other lightly on the spine. His fingers were long and a little ink-stained, capable fingers, the kind you imagine brushing over your collarbone in a moment too quiet to explain. She pretended to read, but mostly she watched him from the corners of her gaze, the subtle furrow in his brow as he turned a page, the shape of his mouth when he concentrated, the way his sweater slipped slightly off one shoulder, revealing the curve where neck met collarbone. Outside, rain had begun, soft at first, then steadier until it became the room's lullaby. The lights inside the shop flickered gently in response, their golden hue making the bookshelves glow as if lit from within. "You read like someone who writes," he said suddenly, not looking up. She blinked. "What makes you say that?" He turned a page. "Writers hold books differently." She considered denying it, but instead set her tea down. "I used to." Now he looked at her, and really looked with a gaze that slipped beneath the surface. Stopped or paused? Paused, she said quietly. But I've been paused for a very long time. He nodded once. It'll come back. The words were so confident, so sure, it startled her. How do you know? He smiled, small, crooked, like a secret blooming at the edge of his lips. Because this place only lets in people who are ready to remember who they are. The fog outside deepened. Later that same day, she returned a book he'd recommended, a slim novel full of longing and gentle ache. She held it in both hands, unsure why it felt difficult to let go. I didn't want it to end, she said softly. He took it from her, fingers brushing hers, just barely. Most beautiful things don't, he replied. His hand lingered just a second too long. The edge of his knuckle grazed hers, and though neither of them moved to hold it longer, the contact rippled through her like a warm draft through an open door. She stayed late that evening. The rain hadn't let up. He lit 2 more lanterns and didn't mention the time. There was music playing softly now, something old and slow, perhaps a string quartet or a piano piece lost to time. At some point she found herself sitting on the floor, leaning against the far wall between 2 low shelves. He brought her a cushion without asking, then sat down across from her, stretching out his legs. The candlelight caught the gold in his eyes. Or maybe it was amber, the kind of color you only notice up close. You live here? She asked. He nodded. All alone? His smile was gentle. No one really lives alone, not when there are books. She tilted her head. But don't you ever get lonely? His answer came slowly. Only when I forget to look up. He did, then looked up right at her. And in that moment there was something unspoken that hung between them, something warm and humming and ancient, the space between bodies charged by the nearness of quiet interest. He shifted forward, just slightly, enough to make her breath pause, enough that she noticed his lips had a fullness that would be easy to soften with a kiss. But he didn't lean in. Instead, he picked up a book resting nearby and turned it over in his hand. Read me something, he said. Her voice shook only a little as she opened the book. The spine cracked softly, and the pages gave off that familiar scent of dust and memory. He sat back and listened, truly listened, as she read a poem about a harbor, a ship, and someone waiting for someone else who had already begun to forget the shape of their face. When she reached the final lines, her voice nearly broke. He said nothing, but looked at her in a way that said everything. That was the moment she realized he wasn't just attractive. He was the kind of beautiful that could undo a person quietly, without needing to ask, without even trying. And that was more dangerous than charm, because it made her want to stay. The days that followed unfolded like paper, not loud or dramatic, not filled with declarations or sudden turns, just slow, steady layers, one moment gently pressed over another, the way a letter folds into its envelope. And she, the traveler, folded into the rhythm of the bookshop as though she'd always been meant to. Some days, she stayed for hours, reading by the windowsill, the fog curled up like a sleeping animal outside. Other times, she sat quietly at the corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea he'd brewed, always differently, always right. He never asked for her name again. He had only asked it once, and after hearing it, repeated it softly to himself as though testing how it tasted in the mouth, as though storing it somewhere safe. But what he did do every day, without fail, was notice her, and not in the way people normally notice, not with the distracted politeness of conversation or the occasional glance across a room. No, he noticed her with stillness, with presence. It was the way his eyes lingered just a heartbeat longer than necessary when she spoke, the way he brushed past her, slow, deliberate, in narrow aisles, as if letting her feel the heat of his nearness without ever touching her outright. The way he remembered how she liked her tea, how she hated being startled, how her fingers twitched slightly when she was moved by something on the page. He watched, and she let herself be seen, and slowly, her bones began to warm in places that had long been cold. It was a Tuesday or something like it. Days in Bellwether-on-Sea had a way of forgetting themselves. She arrived late in the afternoon, wet from rain, cheeks pink from wind. He looked up from a small leather-bound journal he was scribbling in and blinked once as if returning from somewhere far off. Then wordlessly he stood, crossed the room, and unwrapped a thick wool blanket from the back of the chair by the fire. Without asking, he placed it gently around her shoulders. His hands paused briefly as he tucked the blanket in, fingers brushing the back of her neck. His touch was warm, the kind of warm that comes with intention. And she did not move away. That evening they spoke less and looked more. He sat beside her on the floor this time, their backs against the same wall, the warmth of the fire flickering across the books that surrounded them. Outside, the storm cracked in the distance, but inside was all hush and heartbeat. He was reading again, some old collection of stories bound in cracked leather. She leaned her head against the shelf behind her and let her eyes drift sideways. There was something about the way his brow creased while he read something that made her want to smooth it with her fingers. Something about the slight hollow beneath his throat, the line of his collarbone, the way his breathing changed when he found something he liked on the page. It wasn't just attraction, it was hunger and reverence and recognition, like finding a passage in a novel that described you better than you ever could. And maybe it was foolish, maybe it was fast, but she wanted to know how his voice would sound pressed against her skin, how he would kiss when he forgot to be careful, how his hands would feel tangled in hers beneath a quilt in the blue hours of morning. She wanted to be ruined quietly by someone like him, not dramatically, just a slow undoing, thread by thread. "You're not from anywhere," he said softly, still looking at the page. "You carry yourself like someone who's left so many places, the map just stopped trying." She turned to look at him. "And you? Where are you from?" He closed the book, finally meeting her gaze. "Nowhere, which is why I stay." She considered that. "Are you hiding?" His eyes warmed. "No, but I'm tired of being seen for the wrong things." Then gently, before she could respond, "You see things properly. I noticed that the first day." She felt her throat tighten. "Like what?" she asked. He leaned in slightly, his voice lower now. "Like how the quiet isn't empty, how fog isn't a curtain, it's a veil, and how stories aren't always in books." She swallowed. "And what do you think my story is?" There was a long pause. Then his hand reached slow, tentative for hers. When his fingers closed over her palm, it wasn't a grand moment. It wasn't cinematic. It was just right. The kind of right that makes the world tilt so subtly you don't even notice until you're already leaning into it. He didn't speak again. He just held her hand like he meant it. And she let him. Later, when the fire had dimmed and the rain softened, they stood in the little kitchen nook at the back of the shop. She made tea this time, fumbling slightly with the kettle, still unfamiliar with the rhythm of this place, but wanting to match his ease. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with that same slow attention, not evaluating, just absorbing. "Are you always like this?" she asked without turning. "Like what?" "Quiet, thoughtful, mysterious." He chuckled, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. It wasn't loud, but it unspooled something warm in her chest. "No," he said, "only when I want to be remembered." She turned then. He was standing closer now. Her breath caught, just a little. He looked at her mouth and then into her eyes. "And I want you to remember me." The kettle whistled. Neither of them moved. The air stretched taut between them, not sharp, but shimmering. Then he stepped back. "Let it steep for 3 minutes," he said, voice quieter again. "No more, no less." When she left that night, the fog was lighter. He walked her to the door and stood in the threshold. Didn't speak, didn't try to keep her longer. Just reached up, gently brushed a raindrop from her cheek with the back of his knuckle, and gave her a look that felt like a kiss with its coat still on. The door closed behind her with a soft click. She stood outside for a long moment. wrapped in fog, in wool, in the feeling of almost. And as she walked back toward the Salt Lantern Inn, her steps slow on the slick stone, she knew she wasn't lost. Not anymore. She had simply arrived. It had become her favorite time of day, the hour just after the sun had slipped beneath the waves, when the light turned the windows gold and the shop seemed to hum with secrets. She liked arriving then, the world outside going dark, the lamps flickering on one by one, and the faint scent of wood smoke curling through the village like a memory trying to find its way home. He was always there when she came, never waiting in the front, never standing by the door, but always somewhere just beyond, already moving, already in the middle of something. Once it had been sorting a crate of books wrapped in twine. Another time, trimming dried lavender and tucking sprigs between pages of old journals. Tonight, he was lighting the small fire in the hearth, kneeling beside it, sleeves rolled up, a match held between his fingers. The warm orange light caught on his jaw, the hollow of his throat, and the curve of his mouth just before he blew gently on the flame. She watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping in. "You always look like you belong to this place," she said softly. He didn't turn, just smiled faintly at the fire. "I don't. It lets me stay. That's different." She stepped closer. "Then I suppose I should thank it for sharing you." Now he turned, looking up at her with those still dark eyes. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his gaze softened, as though her words had pressed into a place no one had touched in a long time. "You don't have to thank anything," he said, voice low and steady. "You're part of it now." They had stopped pretending she was just a customer. The line between guest and guest of honor had quietly vanished. She no longer waited for permission to sit near him, no longer hesitated before pouring herself tea, no longer worried about taking up space. And he no longer hid the way he watched her. It wasn't overt, it wasn't possessive, it was just steady, quiet, the way you might watch a candle you don't want to go out. That night the fire crackled softly, the books cast long shadows across the walls, and the fog outside had turned the world to parchment. He brought her a book poetry again, but this time, instead of handing it to her, he sat beside her on the worn velvet couch and opened it between them. "You read the left," he said. "I'll take the right." Their knees touched. Not dramatically, just the gentle contact of two people sharing a narrow space and neither one moving away. She took a breath and began. They read aloud, trading verses like the passing of a small secret, his voice a little deeper, a little rougher near the edges, wrapped around the words and softened them. Hers quieter, but rich, gave shape to the white space between lines. It was intimacy disguised as literature, a courtship conducted in rhythm and metaphor. At one point she stumbled over a line, and he laughed gently, not mocking, just amused, just warm. She nudged him with her shoulder. "You're enjoying this too much." He didn't respond right away, just closed the book slowly, letting his fingers rest across the cover. Then he looked at her. "No," he said, "not too much, just enough." Their eyes held, long enough that the breath in her throat forgot what to do. He leaned closer, not abruptly, not boldly, just enough that she could smell the tea on his breath and the faint scent of old paper on his sweater. He paused there, just a whisper away, as if waiting for her to lean the rest of the distance. She didn't, but she didn't pull back either. Instead, she reached up and brushed a stray curl from his forehead. It was a simple gesture, soft, casual, but his eyes closed the moment her fingers touched his skin, as though the contact were something deeper, something he hadn't let himself hope for. "I think I missed you," she said, surprised by her own honesty. He opened his eyes. "You left 3 hours ago." "I know." He smiled, that same quiet smile that never quite reached his lips, but always settled behind his eyes. And then, as though sensing the moment was too tender to last, he stood. "Come on," he said, offering her a hand. "There's something I want to show you." He led her through the shelves, down a narrow hallway she hadn't noticed before, past a curtain of old postcards and a mirror that reflected nothing but candlelight. At the end of the hall was a door she hadn't seen, pale blue, with a small brass knob worn smooth by time. He opened it and stepped aside. She hesitated. "It's not magic," he said. "Not the usual kind anyway, but it's the place I go when I forget how to breathe." That made her smile, and that, finally, made her step inside. It was a room built for quiet. Not silence, but quiet, the kind that exists only in sacred spaces. The walls were lined with books, but not the kind on display in the main shop. These were journals, notebooks, loose-leaf papers in string-tied bundles, a lifetime of thoughts stored on shelves. The fire here was smaller, dimmer, the windows fogged over completely. At the center of the room sat a low table, scattered with candle stubs and a chessboard mid-game. A record player spun something classical and slow, and beside the table 2 cushions. Waiting. He sat first, cross-legged, patient. She followed, lowering herself onto the cushion across from him. There was no game to play, no script, just the hum of whatever had begun between them. They spoke then of real things. He told her about the first book he ever loved, a tattered mystery novel with a broken spine and an ending that still made him sad. He told her about the man who taught him how to bind pages with linen thread, about the summer he nearly left the shop, and the woman who gave him a reason to stay, only to vanish into the fog without warning. "She wasn't like you," he said. She raised a brow. "How so?" "She didn't want to know me, just wanted to be near me. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "And what do I want?" He leaned forward. "I think you want to stay, but you're afraid that means giving up the leaving." The words landed in her chest like a bell toll. She didn't answer, but her hand found his, unprompted. And this time, when he laced their fingers together, it wasn't careful. It was certain. Hours passed. The candles burned lower. The fog outside curled around the windows like something protective. She rested her head on his shoulder. He let it happen. Eventually, her eyes began to drift closed, lulled by warmth and breath and proximity. He shifted only enough to slide an arm around her back, pulling her gently against his chest. The sound of his heartbeat beneath her ear was the most reassuring thing she had heard in years. Not fast, not loud, just steady, like him. And in that room wrapped in firelight and silence and the smell of tea and old parchment, she fell asleep against the chest of a man who had undone her with nothing more than patience. He didn't wake her, didn't move. He just held her, quietly, until the night was more memory than present, and the stars outside the fog blinked like small, distant yeses. Morning returned like a whisper, not with trumpets or urgency, but with soft golden light filtering through the mist and a faint chill curling along the windowsill. The bookshop seemed to stir with her creaking in its bones, stretching into its corners. She woke still wrapped in the scent of him, wood smoke, ink, old paper, a trace of clove. Her head rested on his chest. One of his arms still held her, slack in sleep, his fingers curved loosely over her hip. His breathing was slow and deep, and for a while she just lay there, listening. She had forgotten how peaceful it was to listen to someone else's heart, to measure time by another's warmth. She didn't want to move. Not yet. She traced a slow path along the edge of his cardigan, where the fabric had pulled slightly at the shoulder. The buttons were all mismatched, 2 wooden, 1 pearl, one shaped like a tiny compass. She smiled at that. She could feel the heat of his body even through the wool, the kind of warmth that seeps into you, that makes you drowsy even if you've just woken. Eventually he stirred, not startled, just aware. His arm pulled her just slightly closer before his voice arrived, rough with sleep. "Still here," he murmured. "I wasn't going anywhere," she whispered. He hummed, satisfied. Good. They stayed like that for a long time, until the world outside the fog grew impatient, and someone somewhere rang the bell at the post office, twice. That day they didn't pretend, not even a little. He didn't offer her a book when she came down from the little back room. He offered his hand, and she took it, fingers entwined. No explanations, no nervous glances. The shop felt different now, not less magical, just more known. The way a familiar house feels after someone lights a candle in it, the same, but more vivid, like memory becoming muscle. They moved through the shelves together, close, comfortably so. She helped him restock the historical fiction section, and he pretended not to notice when she paused to read one of the handwritten notes tucked between the pages. "If you're reading this," it said in careful script, "you're not lost, just between chapters." She looked up at him. "You write these?" He shrugged, modest. "Some. Others were left by people passing through. They're beautiful," she said, "little secrets waiting to be found." He gave her a look, then soft, unreadable, and said, "So are you." Later, she found her own note. It was hidden between the pages of a slim volume of travel essays, one he'd shelved just that morning. The paper was small, torn at the edge, and smelled faintly of cedar. "You are becoming dangerous to me," it read, "and I have never wanted danger more." Her fingers trembled as she folded it closed. She slipped it into the pocket of her coat, near her heart. She didn't say anything that afternoon. Neither did he, but something between them shifted, not abruptly, not with drama, but like a tide turning, inevitable, gentle, pulling them closer without force. Evenings came faster after that. The sun bowed out early, and the fog rolled in with purpose. They spent longer in the back room, curled on the couch or reading side by side. Sometimes she lay with her head in his lap, and he stroked her hair absently while reading a weathered copy of Neruda aloud. They didn't kiss, not at first, but the wanting thickened between them, slow, molten, like honey in warm hands. It lived in the pauses, in the touches that lingered half a second longer, in the way he exhaled when she leaned her weight into him, in the way she would close her eyes just to feel the timbre of his voice as he read. Desire was not a fire in this place. It was a candle. It burned low and steady, and it made shadows dance on the walls. It happened on a Thursday. She had spent most of the afternoon upstairs, writing. Something had opened in her, some old door rusted shut for years now, swinging wide. The words came easily. The light stayed soft. She wore his cardigan. When she came down, he was in the middle of organizing a series of ancient atlases, the kind with hand-inked coastlines and dragons sketched into forgotten waters. He looked up when he saw her, and whatever he had been about to say never made it to his mouth. Instead, he crossed the room slowly, stopped just in front of her. His hands hovered near her waist, waiting. She looked up at him, no fear, no hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, and then finally he kissed her. It was not a careful kiss. It was not the trembling sort passed between pages or performed on stages. It was quiet and complete, full of knowing, full of longing. His hand slid to her waist. Hers rose to his chest, and they leaned into one another like doors swinging inward at the same time. Time stilled. The air around them disappeared. When they broke apart, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his collarbone, his hand tracing lazy circles at the small of her back. "Tell me something," she said, voice barely more than breath. "Anything. What do I mean to you?" He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, softly, "You're the first person who ever made me wonder what I'd been waiting for." They kissed again that night, and again after that. Always slow, always quiet, like the world outside might listen in, and they were reluctant to share, but the kisses changed things. The silences between them became charged, not uncomfortable, but intimate, full of things unsaid and still understood. She noticed new things about him, the way he held his breath just before touching her, the sound he made, that tiny sigh when her fingers slid into his hair, the way he blinked slowly after each kiss, as though trying to memorize the moment. And he noticed her too, in ways that went beyond the body. How she bit her lip when she was writing something tender. How she whispered lines of dialogue to herself when she thought no one could hear. How she sometimes traced the spines of books with her fingertip, as if they were lovers, too. He watched her the way artists study light, the way poets dream of names. One evening, she woke to find herself alone on the couch. The fire was low, the candles nearly out. She rose, wrapped herself in the blanket, and padded through the shop on bare feet. She found him in the front of the store, standing beside the large window, watching the fog roll past the glass. "You okay?" she whispered. He turned, smiled. "Didn't want to wake you." She stepped into him, pressed her face to his chest, wrapped her arms around his middle. He held her immediately, his chin resting against the top of her head. "This place," she murmured. "It's changing me." He nodded. "That's what it does." "But you," she pulled back to look up at him. "You're the part I don't want to leave behind." He bent his forehead to hers. "Then don't." The rain began like a whisper, just a soft tapping on the windows, the kind of sound you almost miss if you're reading something beautiful, the kind of sound that seems to echo from within rather than without. She was lying on the rug in the back room, scribbling in her notebook, legs curled beneath her, still wearing his cardigan. He was beside her, cross-legged with a book open on his lap, one hand absently resting on her ankle, as if to say, "I'm here," even when he wasn't speaking. Neither of them noticed the first gust of wind, or the second. It wasn't until the third, the one that rattled the windows, made the fire hiss in protest, that they looked up. The fog had thickened, not in the usual way, soft and silken, but in waves, heavy and unsettled. There was movement in it, shadows that didn't belong to anything, wind that moaned instead of whispered. He stood, crossing to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out. She followed. "What is it?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "The cliff paths will flood." "Will that—" she hesitated. "Will that affect the shop?" He didn't answer immediately, just looked out at the trees bowing in the wind, the edge of the sea foaming angrily below. "The shop's old," he said finally, "but the path is fragile. It shifts, like the fog, like everything here." She watched his expression, quiet concern creasing the corners of his mouth. Not fear, but a familiar kind of sadness, like someone remembering how it feels to be left behind. "I should go back," she said, even though every part of her didn't want to. He looked at her then, fully, as if memorizing her face before it disappeared. "If you don't," he said, voice low, "you might not be able to for a while." She nodded slowly, trying to smile. He helped her gather her things, held her coat open while she slid into it, buttoned it for her, carefully, one at a time, his fingers brushing against her chest, her throat, her collar. "You'll come back," she said, not as a question, but as a promise. "If the path allows it," he whispered. And then, just before she turned away, he took her face in both hands, not rushed, not desperate, and kissed her. It was a kiss full of rain and salt, and every word he hadn't yet said, not gentle this time, but deep, anchoring. She let it linger, pressed her hands to his chest, breathed him in, and then she left. The wind caught her the moment she stepped outside. It howled like something wild, tugging at her coat, her hair, her thoughts. The world was soaked in silver fog and rain and stormlight swirling together like spilled ink across a blank page. The path that had once been so familiar was suddenly unrecognizable. Trees bent where they hadn't before. Stones shifted beneath her boots. The sound of the sea had risen to a roar. But she kept walking, one foot then another. She had made the walk before. She would make it again. She reached the inn, soaked through. The fire was already lit in the hearth, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor. The innkeeper met her at the door with a blanket and a knowing look. "He told you to leave, didn't he?" the woman said softly. She nodded, too tired to ask how she knew. "That storm's a wicked one," the innkeeper murmured. "Like the ones we used to have when I was a girl. Takes out more than trees, that kind. Takes out paths." That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, wrapped in the blanket, watching the storm claw at the edges of the village. The fog lit up now and then with flashes of distant lightning, not enough to see anything clearly, but enough to feel the pulse of the sea. The wind screamed. The rain slammed against the glass. She held her notebook against her chest and listened for the sound of the bell above the bookshop door, knowing she couldn't hear it from here and longing for it anyway. By morning, the storm had passed, but something had changed. The village looked the same, roofs intact, windows unbroken. The sea had settled into its restless sleep, but when she tried to return to the bookshop, the path was gone. Not blocked, not flooded. Gone. The curve of the trail that led past the tea shop, beyond the chapel, and down toward the cliffs where once a narrow lane had twisted into a secret hollow now ended in brambles and rockfall. She stared for a long time, walked the perimeter, called out. Nothing answered. Not the wind, not the gulls, not him. Just silence. Fog. The smell of rain-soaked earth, and the faint ache of absence. She came back every day. Morning, afternoon, sometimes both. The innkeeper said nothing, just handed her tea when she returned, gave her an extra quilt, watched her with a kind of patient sympathy that didn't require words. The villagers, too, seemed to know better than to ask. Bellwether-on-Sea was full of stories, and everyone had lost something to the fog at some point. A friend, a dog, a memory, a book. She searched the cliffs, the paths, the coves, even asked the boy with the fishing rod if he'd seen the shop. He shook his head. Sometimes it stays gone for a long time, he said. How long? He shrugged. Until it's ready. She left notes. Folded pages tucked into hollow stones, beneath mossy logs, in the pages of abandoned books near the shore, each one addressed to him, sometimes full of poetry, sometimes nonsense, sometimes just, I miss you, come back. She dreamed of him most nights, not always in the shop, sometimes beside her in the inn, sometimes walking beside her through fields of grass that hadn't existed in this town, once on a train that she didn't remember boarding. In every dream, he kissed her, and in every dream he disappeared before morning. The days turned to weeks. Her notebook filled with sketches of his hands, passages of remembered dialogue, poems she'd once been too afraid to write. The cardigan he'd loaned her still smelled faintly of paper and pine. She kept it beside her pillow. She was changed now, not in the way dramatic stories insist, not louder or bolder, just softer, like something inside her had been made quiet but strong, like something had found its shape. One evening, as the fog began to roll in thick again, she sat by the inn's fire and wrote a letter she didn't plan to leave anywhere. She simply wrote it because she had to. Dear you, if you ever return, I won't ask where you've been. I won't ask why it took so long. I'll just make tea. I'll open the book to the page you left off. I'll read it aloud until you fall asleep again. Because I still remember the sound of your heart beneath my ear. Because the world doesn't hum the same without you. Because I didn't fall in love with a place. I fell in love with a person who made it feel like home. And I'm still here. Still turning pages. Still waiting. She folded the letter and pressed it between the pages of the poetry book he first gave her. Then she went to sleep, alone, and dreamed again of warm hands, quiet laughter, and a door that opened only for her. It happened on a morning like any other. Gray light spilled across the floor of her room at the inn, and the smell of salt hung in the air like breath that hadn't quite exhaled. She stretched slowly beneath the covers, half asleep, half hoping the fog would be heavy, the thick kind, the shop kind. She had stopped expecting it, but she hadn't stopped hoping. That was the difference. She dressed slowly, pulled on the cardigan again, the one that still carried his scent like a story she hadn't finished, and padded downstairs barefoot to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the windows. The innkeeper handed her a cup of tea without a word. The traveler nodded her thanks, sipped, and went to the bench beneath the window. The cushion there had begun to mold to her shape. She liked that. Being part of the furniture in a place that kept forgiving her for staying. She looked out at the fog and whispered, "Just one sign." She didn't expect it to come so soon. An hour later, stepping into the bakery for something warm, she found it waiting. Not in a grand envelope, not in a formal hand. Just a folded slip of paper tucked inside a bag of fresh rosemary bread, her name written on it in the same ink she had seen on the shelves of the shop. She opened it with trembling fingers, flour dusting her sleeve. "Come just before dusk. Take the long path. Don't speak to anyone on the way." No signature, no date, no need. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs, and for a moment she had to close her eyes just to keep from floating straight off the ground. She left the bread uneaten on the counter of her room. She didn't sit. She didn't write. She simply watched the clock and listened to the world outside draw breath. The fog rolled in steadily as the sun dropped that strange silver hush that made everything feel paused, as though the village was holding its breath too. She wrapped herself in her coat, slipped her notebook into the inside pocket, and stepped outside. The cardigan beneath the coat was his. She wanted it close. If he was still part of this place, she wanted part of him touching her when she walked through the door again. She took the long path, just like the note said. Not the one past the chapel and down the hill, but the old route, the cliffside road with the uneven stones and the ivy-choked archway, a path that hadn't seemed like a path until tonight. Fog gathered low at her ankles and curled up her calves like curious fingers. It was quiet. Even the sea had stilled. Only the sound of her boots steady on the wet stones, and her breathing a little too fast, a little too full of "please let it be there." And then, through the fog, a flicker. Warm light, soft gold, low and flickering, like a lantern swaying in a doorway. She took another step, and another, and the door appeared. It was the same, exactly the same. Painted green, ivy curling along the frame, a small seashell bell waiting just above the handle. Her breath caught as she reached for it. Her hand hovered there, just for a moment, fingers trembling. Then she opened the door. The smell hit her first. Old books, candle wax, clove and rain-damp wood. Then warmth. Like someone had been tending the fire for hours just for her. The room was aglow with it, soft orange and gold spilling from every corner, shadows dancing across the ceiling beams. The books were still there, every stack, every crooked shelf. And so was he. He stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled to his elbows, fingers still ink-stained. His hair was slightly longer now, falling into his eyes. He hadn't shaved. The shadows along his jaw made her throat tighten. He looked up the moment the door closed. He didn't smile. Not yet. He just looked at her like someone remembering their own name after a long, cold sleep. "I wasn't sure," she whispered. "I was," he replied. She took a step forward. "The path needed time," he said softly. "Some things close to remind you what it feels like when they open." She swallowed. "I waited." "I know." He moved out from behind the counter. "You wrote to me. You got them?" He nodded. "Not all. Just the ones you meant the most." Her eyes burned. "You found my letter?" He stepped closer. "I read it 3 times. Then I built a shelf for it." She laughed a choked sound, wet and grateful. "That sounds like you." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. For a long time, they said nothing. He traced the edge of her wrist with his thumb. She leaned her forehead against his jaw, breathing him in. Then he whispered, "I didn't know if you'd still want me." She stepped back, just enough to see him. "I never wanted anything else." And then, slowly, like a page turning, he kissed her. It was different this time. Not urgent, not the kiss of parting or reunion, but one full of yes, and here you are, and I will keep this moment warm forever. His hands cupped her face, her coat slipping from her shoulders. Her fingers curled into the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer. They kissed like nothing had ended, like nothing had broken, like the time apart had only stretched the space that love could fill. Later, they sat beside the fire, the same cushion beneath them, the same mug between them, steam rising slow and lazy. The shop creaked in all the right places. A new note rested on the table beside them. She hadn't written it. It read, "This story continues, even if the book ends. Come back." Again and again. She looked at him. "Is that a promise?" He nodded. "Or an invitation?" He smiled. "Both." She stayed the night. She stayed the week. And then, without fanfare, without ceremony, she stayed. She helped him bind books. She stocked shelves. She read aloud by lamplight and kissed him between paragraphs. She hung her coat on the same hook every evening and wrote letters she no longer needed to send. The shop let her stay. The fog welcomed her name. And the man who once belonged only to the silence learned to speak love in a language she already knew by heart. Some endings don't feel like endings at all. They feel like breathing out for the first time, like setting a suitcase down and realizing you never want to pick it back up again. That's what it felt like to stay. No fanfare, no grand decisions. Just the quiet unfolding of morning after morning in the same place. The same teacup, the same cardigan, the same hands brushing hers when they reached for the same book. She didn't plan to stay forever. She just never found a reason to leave. They settled into a rhythm, not a routine exactly, because the shop refused to behave that predictably, but a rhythm, a mutual pace, a shared heartbeat. He would rise before her most days, light the lamps, warm the stove, grind the beans for coffee she always pretended not to need. She would come down wrapped in his sweater, hair still soft from sleep, and find him already leaning in the doorway, waiting, always waiting, not with impatience, but with devotion, like every morning was a page he'd been waiting to read. They reopened the shop, properly this time. She suggested it. He had hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. If you stay, it shouldn't hide anymore. So they wrote a new sign. She painted the letters slowly, carefully, on the old wooden board while he held her hips steady with one hand and whispered edits from behind her ear. Whispering pages stayed as the name. But beneath it, in smaller script, they added, "We open on foggy days," or when your heart needs a place to rest. The villagers noticed, of course. The boy with the fishing rod came by and left 3 sea glass marbles on the doorstep. The innkeeper sent over a jar of blackberry jam and a note that read, "About time." They didn't ask many questions. Bellwether-on-Sea rarely did. They simply nodded and accepted the bookshop's return like an old friend who'd wandered off for a while and finally come home. Some said the shop looked the same. Others claimed it was warmer now, brighter, that the fog lingered longer near its windows, that the light inside seemed to flicker in rhythm with the tide. All of it was true, and none of it mattered. The people who needed it found it. They began writing together, not loudly, not all at once. It started with him slipping a line into her journal when she wasn't looking. She found it days later, tucked between thoughts. "Your laugh is the sound of remembering something beautiful you thought you'd forgotten." So she wrote back. Just a single line. "You walk like someone who doesn't know how much gravity loves you." And so it went. Lines scribbled on receipts, on bookmarks, on paper napkins beside unfinished breakfasts. Eventually they began collecting them, stringing them together, building something out of the small, shining pieces. A book. Their book. Afternoons were their quietest time. Most visitors came in the mornings, wanderers, weathered travelers, and lost lovers hoping to stumble across something that knew their name. But the afternoons belonged to them. She would sit in the sun patch near the window, knees pulled up to her chest, writing in her notebook. He would rest his head in her lap, a novel open on his chest, fingers laced with hers. Sometimes they didn't speak for an hour, sometimes longer. The silence never felt empty. It felt like agreement. On one such afternoon, a light rain began. She watched it fall across the shop's wide front windows, tracing the droplets with her fingertip against the glass. He was dozing against her, warm and familiar, a book long since forgotten in his hands. She whispered, "You know what I miss?" He stirred slightly. Being undone. His eyes opened slowly. Undone? Not in a dramatic way, not chaos, just, she paused, turning to look down at him. The feeling that someone sees you so clearly it makes the rest of the world blur. He smiled, the sleep still softening his voice. "You mean like this?" And then he pulled her down by the collar of her sweater, kissed her slow and certain, and made everything else disappear. That evening she found another note, this one folded inside a book of fairy tales she'd been cataloging. No name, no title, just that same ink she'd come to know better than her own. "If this shop is a spell, you're the one who made it real." She found him in the back room, mending a chair with one leg propped up on a crate. "I found your note," she said. He didn't look up. "Which one?" She walked over, slid her arms around his waist, rested her cheek against his back. "The one that made me realize I already live here." He set the tool down, turned in her arms, and kissed her temple. "I know." They held each other for a long time that night. Standing there in the back room, surrounded by stacks of unsorted books and half-drunk mugs of tea, the world outside forgotten. He tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, kissed her shoulder through the fabric of her shirt. "You still write like you're searching," he murmured. "I am." "For what?" She smiled. "The next line." He nodded. "Let's write it together." And they did. Some endings don't feel like endings at all. They feel like breathing out for the first time, like setting a suitcase down and realizing you never want to pick it back up again. That's what it felt like to stay. No fanfare, no grand decisions. Just the quiet unfolding of morning after morning in the same place, the same teacup, the same cardigan, the same hands brushing hers when they reached for the same book. She didn't plan to stay forever. She just never found a reason to leave. They settled into a rhythm, not a routine exactly, because the shop refused to behave that predictably, but a rhythm, a mutual pace, a shared heartbeat. He would rise before her most days, light the lamps, warm the stove, grind the beans for coffee she always pretended not to need. She would come down wrapped in his sweater, hair still soft from sleep, and find him already leaning in the doorway, waiting, always waiting, not with impatience, but with devotion, like every morning was a page he'd been waiting to read. They reopened the shop, properly this time. She suggested it. He had hesitated just for a moment, then nodded. If you stay, it shouldn't hide anymore. So they wrote a new sign. She painted the letters slowly, carefully, on the old wooden board while he held her hips steady with one hand and whispered edits from behind her ear. Whispering pages stayed as the name, but beneath it, in smaller script, they added, "We open on foggy days, or when your heart needs a place to rest." The villagers noticed, of course. The boy with the fishing rod came by and left 3 sea-glass marbles on the doorstep. The innkeeper sent over a jar of blackberry jam and a note that read, "About time." They didn't ask many questions. Bellwether-on-Sea rarely did. They simply nodded and accepted the bookshop's return like an old friend who'd wandered off for a while and finally come home. Some said the shop looked the same. Others claimed it was warmer now, brighter, that the fog lingered longer near its windows, that the light inside seemed to flicker in rhythm with the tide. All of it was true, and none of it mattered. The people who needed it found it. They began writing together, not loudly, not all at once. It started with him slipping a line into her journal when she wasn't looking. She found it days later, tucked between thoughts. Your laugh is the sound of remembering something beautiful you thought you'd forgotten. So she wrote back, just a single line. You walk like someone who doesn't know how much gravity loves you. And so it went. Lines scribbled on receipts, on bookmarks, on paper napkins beside unfinished breakfasts. Eventually they began collecting them, stringing them together, building something out of the small shining pieces. A book. Their book. Afternoons were their quietest time. Most visitors came in the mornings, wanderers, weathered travelers, and lost lovers hoping to stumble across something that knew their name. But the afternoons belonged to them. She would sit in the sun patch near the window, knees pulled up to her chest, writing in her notebook. He would rest his head in her lap, a novel open on his chest, fingers laced with hers. Sometimes they didn't speak for an hour, sometimes longer. The silence never felt empty. It felt like agreement. On one such afternoon, a light rain began. She watched it fall across the shop's wide front windows, tracing the droplets with her fingertip against the glass. He was dozing against her, warm and familiar, a book long since forgotten in his hands. She whispered, "You know what I miss?" He stirred slightly. Being undone. His eyes opened slowly. Undone? Not in a dramatic way, not chaos, just... She paused, turning to look down at him. The feeling that someone sees you so clearly it makes the rest of the world blur. He smiled, the sleep still softening his voice. "You mean like this?" And then he pulled her down by the collar of her sweater, kissed her slow and certain, and made everything else disappear. That evening she found another note, this one folded inside a book of fairy tales she'd been cataloging. No name, no title, just that same ink she'd come to know better than her own. "If this shop is a spell, you're the one who made it real." She found him in the back room, mending a chair with one leg propped up on a crate. "I found your note," she said. He didn't look up. "Which one?" She walked over, slid her arms around his waist, rested her cheek against his back. "The one that made me realize I already live here." He set the tool down, turned in her arms, and kissed her temple. "I know." They held each other for a long time that night. Standing there in the back room, surrounded by stacks of unsorted books and half-drunk mugs of tea, the world outside forgotten. He tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, kissed her shoulder through the fabric of her shirt. "You still write like you're searching," he murmured. "I am." "For what?" She smiled. "The next line." He nodded. "Let's write it together." And they did. "Would you like me to conclude the story with part 5b? The last page is lit by lamplight, a soft final passage that gently seals their love in place one last night, one last note, and the sense that some stories never really end. You said, "Next." ChatGPT said, "Here is part 5b. The last page is lit by lamplight, the closing passage of the bookshop at the edge of the world. This final act is a soft landing, a gentle settling of the story into stillness, fulfillment, and the kind of love that hums low and permanent. It holds deep peace, lasting warmth, and a sense of completion, while staying in the dreamlike, sleep-safe tone you've cultivated. This final installment exceeds 500 words, as requested. The bookshop at the edge of the world. Part 5b. The last page is lit by lamplight. Some evenings slipped in so gently you hardly noticed they'd begun. This one came with lamplight and the soft clink of two mugs beside each other. Rain whispered against the windows. The fire cracked like it was telling its own story in the background, one they'd heard before and loved for its familiar ending. She was on the floor in her usual spot, the rug pulled beneath her like a shawl. He was lying on his stomach beside her, head propped in one hand, reading something she'd written that afternoon. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He read like someone sipping from a glass he didn't want to empty. When he finally looked up, there was a pause, not hesitation, just reverence. Then softly, "This line." She waited. Some loves are not meteors or bonfires, but coals tucked into the heart, burning long after the room has gone dark. He blinked, slow. That's the one that'll stay. She looked down, suddenly shy. It's about you. He reached for her hand, didn't take it, just covered it with his palm, warm and steady. I know. That night, they closed the shop early. No bell, no lantern, just the two of them moving slowly through their small, lovely world books reshelved, the kettle rinsed, the chairs straightened, and a note left on the counter that read, "We'll be back after we've finished a chapter or two." She took his hand as they turned out the last light. Their footsteps creaked softly across the wood as they climbed the narrow stairs, laughter trailing behind them like the faintest perfume. The room above the shop was small, but perfect. A low bed beneath a slanted window, shelves stacked with half-read novels and little treasures, seashells, bottle caps, dried flowers, a pressed train ticket from a journey never explained. She slipped out of her dress while he watched, slowly, comfortably. He removed his sweater the way he always did, one arm first, a stretch, the hem caught briefly over his stomach. She watched the lines of him revealed in the flickering candlelight, the quiet strength, the softness in his shoulders, the gravity in his eyes when he looked at her like that, like she was a thing made of wonder. No rush, no urgency, just unfolding. They lay together beneath the quilt she'd mended that winter, the one with the patch shaped like a fox, the one that always smelled faintly of cedar and chamomile. He kissed her neck. She laughed softly into his chest. They didn't speak much. There was no need to narrate something that already felt complete. Just fingers tracing lines on skin, breaths shared, limbs tangled, the quiet intimacy of people who had chosen each other in every possible way. Outside, the fog curled close. Inside, the fire dimmed to embers. The shop below creaked gently, as if sighing in contentment. She turned her face toward him, lips brushing his shoulder, and whispered, "If I hadn't come to Bellwether." He touched her cheek. "You were always going to." She smiled. "How do you know?" "Because this place only calls people it already belongs to." She let that settle into her chest like warmth in winter, let her fingers trace lazy shapes on his stomach. "And you?" she asked. "What do I belong to?" He leaned in and kissed her softly, then pulled back just enough to say, "Me." That night, sleep came easily, deeply, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing left to fear, nothing left undone. The storm had passed, the path had held, and the place that once only opened on foggy days now stayed lit long into the night. Sometime before morning she woke. The candle was nearly out. He was still asleep, one hand resting against her hip, breath soft and steady. She didn't move, didn't want to. Instead, she reached with one hand toward the small table beside the bed, opened the notebook always waiting there, and wrote by candlelight. Just one line. "We are not a chapter. We are the whole book." The next day, someone new would find the shop. Someone with a folded map and tired eyes. Someone who thought they were looking for a story, but were actually looking for home. And when they stepped through the door, they'd find two people behind the counter. One with a cardigan and ink-stained fingers. One with a soft voice and a poet's heart. They would smile not just politely, but truly, and offer them a cup of tea, a seat by the fire, and a book that had been waiting for them all along. And maybe, if the light was just right, if the fog was thick and the air felt like remembering, they'd hear it, that gentle humming beneath the floorboards, that quiet, steady pulse in the walls, the sound of a bookshop in love,